In the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest, where winter bit deeper than any enemy bullet, a 19-year-old boy from upstate New York discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the refusal to let fear win. Francis Sherman Curry had enlisted in the United States Army straight out of high school, driven by the same patriotic fervor that had swept through American towns since Pearl Harbor shattered the nation's illusions of safety. By December 1944, he found himself assigned to Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, a unit that would soon find itself at the center of one of the most desperate and consequential battles of the entire war. The Germans had launched their last great offensive through the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, catching the Allied forces completely off guard in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had scraped together his last reserves of men, tanks, and fuel for this massive gamble, hoping to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and perhaps force a negotiated peace that would allow Nazi Germany to survive. The 30th Division, nicknamed Old Hickory after Andrew Jackson, had been rushed to the northern shoulder of the German breakthrough to stem the tide, and it was here, near the small Belgian town of Malmedy, that Francis Curry would etch his name into the annals of military legend. The date was December 21st, 1944, 5 days into the German offensive, and the situation was deteriorating by the hour. American units were scattered, communications were chaotic, and the weather had grounded Allied air superiority, leaving German armor free to roam the narrow roads and frozen fields. Curry, now a technical sergeant despite his youth, had been positioned with his squad near a crucial bridge over the Amblève River, a crossing that the Germans desperately needed to maintain their advance toward the Maze River and beyond. The bridge at Malmedy wasn't just a piece of infrastructure. It was a lifeline, a choke point that could determine whether the German offensive would succeed or stall. If the Germans captured this bridge intact, they could pour tanks and troops across the river, outflank American defensive positions, and potentially break through to the coast. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and Curry understood this intuitively even if he didn't have the strategic overview that generals possessed in their warm headquarters miles from the front. What he knew was cold, exhaustion, and the bone-deep certainty that his position was all that stood between the enemy and disaster. The morning had begun with the familiar misery of an Ardennes winter, temperatures well below freezing, a gray sky that promised more snow, and the constant, gnawing hunger that came from inadequate rations and the body's desperate need for calories to maintain warmth. Curry and his men had dug their foxholes into the frozen earth, a task that required burning gasoline to thaw the ground enough to excavate, and they had established firing positions covering the approaches to the bridge. They were armed with the standard infantry weapons of the American Army, M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and a few bazookas that represented their only real defense against German armor. The bazooka was a notoriously finicky weapon, prone to misfires and requiring the gunner to expose himself to enemy fire to achieve a hit, but it was all they had against the Panther and Tiger tanks that the Germans were fielding in increasing numbers. As dawn broke on that December morning, the distant rumble of engines signaled what Curry had been dreading, the approach of German armored forces. Through the morning mist and falling snow, he could make out the ominous shapes of 3 German tanks advancing toward the bridge, their treads grinding the frozen road surface, their long cannon barrels questing for targets. The tanks were supported by infantry, perhaps a company of German soldiers moving cautiously in the armor's wake, using the steel behemoths as mobile shields against American small arms fire. Curry's heart must have hammered against his ribs as he assessed the situation with the clarity that combat sometimes grants. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and positioned on the wrong side of the river from his main defensive line. His squad was scattered, some men wounded from earlier skirmishes, and the nearest American armor was miles away, fighting its own desperate battles against the German onslaught. Retreat across the bridge would mean abandoning it to the Germans, likely with the explosives needed to demolish it still in place and unfired. Staying meant almost certain death against 3 tanks and their accompanying infantry. But Francis Curry was 19 years old, and like many of his generation, he possessed a stubbornness that mistook itself for immortality. He made his choice, and in doing so, set in motion a sequence of events that would define not just his own life, but the lives of thousands of soldiers who would never know his name but would owe him their survival. The Feist tank rumbled closer, its commander likely confident that American resistance would crumble as it had in so many other sectors during the opening days of the offensive, but Francis Currie had no intention of crumbling. He grabbed his bazooka and sprinted to a forward position, his breath coming in ragged clouds of vapor in the freezing air, his fingers already numb despite the wool gloves that were standard issue but inadequate for Belgian winter. The bazooka was a 2.36-inch rocket launcher, officially the M1A1, a weapon that had proven effective against lighter German armor earlier in the war but was increasingly outmatched by the thicker frontal armor of the Panther tanks that now approached. Currie knew its limitations intimately. He knew that a frontal shot would likely bounce off or fail to penetrate, that he needed to aim for the thinner side armor, the tracks, or the vulnerable rear where the engine compartment sat today. He also knew that to achieve such a shot, he would need to expose himself to the tank's machine guns and the supporting infantry, that he would have perhaps one chance before the German gunner spotted his muzzle flash and turned the tank's main gun on his position. The tank was approximately 200 yards away when Currie fired his first rocket, the backblast kicking up snow and dirt behind him, the weapon's distinctive whoosh cutting through the battle noise. The rocket struck true, hitting the tank's track and disabling it, but not destroying it. The tank ground to a halt, its treads shredded, but its main gun remained operational and now it knew where he was. Currie didn't wait to see the turret begin to traverse toward him. He was already moving, running crouched through the snow to a secondary position he had scouted earlier, a shallow depression behind a stone wall that offered marginal cover. The tank fired, its 75mm shell exploding where he had been seconds before, the concussion knocking snow from the branches of nearby trees and leaving his ears ringing. But Currie was already reloading, his movements practiced and automatic despite the terror that must have been coursing through his veins. He emerged from behind the wall and fired again, this time hitting the tank's hull, the rocket penetrating and setting the vehicle ablaze. The crew abandoned their mount, scrambling out of hatches as flames licked at their uniforms, and Currie turned his attention to the second tank, which had been maneuvering to get a clear shot at his new position. What happened next demonstrated the tactical cunning that would earn Currie his place in history. Rather than engaging the second tank from his current position, where the German gunner had likely zeroed in, Currie executed a flanking movement that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances but was made possible by the smoke and confusion of the burning Feist tank. He ran across open ground, exposed to enemy fire, and reached a third firing position on the opposite side of the road from where he had started. The German tank commanders, trained to expect methodical American defensive tactics, were confused by this lone infantryman who seemed to be everywhere at once, who refused to stay in one place and die as proper doctrine suggested he should. From his new position, Currie engaged the second tank, but his rocket glanced off the thick frontal armor, and now the tank's machine guns were spraying the area around him, forcing him to hug the frozen earth while snow and dirt kicked up from the impacts. He needed a different approach, and he found it in the form of an abandoned anti-aircraft position that contained a .30 caliber machine gun. Abandoning the bazooka for the moment, Currie crawled through the snow, his uniform becoming soaked and then freezing, his hands aching with cold, until he reached the machine gun. He set it up with the speed of training and experience that belied his 19 years and opened fire on the tank's vision ports and the infantry supporting it. The machine gun couldn't penetrate the tank's armor, but it could suppress the crew, prevent them from seeing clearly, and most importantly, it could mow down the German infantry who were trying to flank his position. The supporting German soldiers, caught in the open by Currie's accurate fire, went to ground or fell, their attack faltering as they lost the protection of their armored support. This gave Currie the breathing room he needed to return to his bazooka, and when he fired his third rocket at the second tank, it struck the weaker top armor where the turret met the hull, killing the crew and silencing the vehicle. 2 tanks destroyed, but the third remained, and by now the German commander understood that he faced no ordinary defender. The third tank began to withdraw, its crew unwilling to risk their lives against this phantom who struck from multiple directions and seemed impervious to fear. But Currie wasn't finished with them. He pursued, moving through the woods parallel to the road, using the terrain to mask his approach until he was able to fire one final rocket that disabled the retreating tank, completing the destruction of the entire German armored element. 3 tanks, 3 kills, and the bridge remained in American hands. But the battle was far from over, and the cost of victory was about to become painfully clear. With the German armor burning and their infantry scattered, Francis Currie might have been forgiven if he had taken a moment to catch his breath, to let his racing heart slow, to feel the warmth of survival coursing through his frozen limbs, but the sounds of battle had not ceased. As the smoke from the destroyed tanks drifted across the snow-covered landscape, Currie became aware of something that cut through the residual adrenaline of combat. The cries of wounded men, American voices calling for help from positions forward of his own, cut off by the German advance and now lying exposed in the killing ground between the lines. There were 5 of them, soldiers from his own regiment who had been caught in the initial tank assault, wounded and unable to move, lying in the open where any German soldier with a rifle could end their lives, where the cold itself would finish what enemy weapons had begun if they weren't moved to shelter soon. The temperature was dropping as afternoon gave way to evening, and in the Ardennes in December, exposure was as deadly as bullets. Currie could see them from his position, or at least he could see where they were, sprawled in the snow 200 to 300 yards forward of his line, near the baning hulks of the tanks he had just destroyed. To reach them, he would have to cross the same open ground he had just traversed under fire. But now the Germans had recovered from their initial shock and were re-establishing their positions. Now the element of surprise was gone. Now any movement in that killing zone would draw immediate and accurate fire. The logical choice, the militarily sound decision, would have been to wait for darkness, to organize a proper rescue mission with covering fire and smoke, but logic didn't account for the human cost of waiting. Those men were bleeding, freezing, dying while the debate over rescue tactics played out in warm command posts. Currie didn't debate. He acted. He crawled from his position, keeping low to the ground, using every fold in the terrain, every snowdrift, every bit of cover the devastated landscape offered. The distance was approximately 400 meters, a crawl that would take him through areas swept by German machine guns, past positions where enemy soldiers watched for exactly this kind of rescue attempt, through snow that soaked his uniform and stole his body heat with every inch of progress. He moved slowly, agonizingly slowly, because speed meant exposure and exposure meant death, both for him and for the men he was trying to save. The first wounded soldier was a private from Ohio, his legs shattered by machine gun fire. Conscious but barely, his face gray with shock and cold. Currie assessed him quickly, applied a tourniquet to stem the bleeding, and then began the journey back, dragging the wounded man through the snow, shielding him with his own body when German fire searched for them, stopping motionless when the bullets came too close, then moving again when the fire shifted. It took nearly an hour to get the first man to safety, an hour of pure physical exertion while combat raged around them, while mortar rounds fell and small arms cracked, while the cold worked its way into Currie's core and made his fingers clumsy and his thoughts sluggish. But he didn't stop. He went back, crawling again through that 400 meters of hell, finding the second wounded man, a sergeant with chest wounds who couldn't walk and could barely breathe. Currie fashioned a litter from branches and his own equipment, dragging it and its precious cargo back across the exposed ground, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning, his mind focused on nothing but the next meter, the next cover, the next breath. The third man had a head wound, delirious and fighting, making the rescue harder because he didn't understand that Currie was trying to save him, that the hands dragging him weren't enemy hands. Currie had to subdue him gently, to protect him from his own struggles, all while maintaining the stealth that kept them both alive. By now the Germans knew what was happening, and the fire intensified, rounds cracking overhead, mortars bracketing his route. But Currie had learned the rhythm of this particular battlefield, knew where the Germans were looking, knew how to move in the blind spots between their positions. The fourth man was unconscious, which made him easier to move in some ways but more worrying in others, because Currie couldn't tell if he was still alive, if this desperate effort was saving a life or recovering a corpse. He was alive? Barely, and Currie got him back. The fifth man was the farthest out, pinned near the lead tank that Currie had destroyed, and by now daylight was fading, the short winter afternoon giving way to the deeper cold of evening. Curry was beyond exhaustion, operating on will alone. His body pushed past limits he didn't know he had. He reached the final soldier, a lieutenant who had been leading the forward position when the tanks hit, his wounds severe but his eyes bright with recognition when he saw Curry. "I knew someone would come," the lieutenant whispered, and those words, that faith in the bonds between soldiers, gave Curry the strength for one more journey. He brought the lieutenant back as darkness finally closed over the battlefield, as the temperature plummeted and the stars emerged cold and distant above the smoke and ruin of Malmedy. 5 men, 5 trips through 400 meters of enemy-controlled terrain, 5 lives saved by the refusal of one 19-year-old to accept that some things were impossible. The night that followed the day's heroics was not a night of rest for Francis Curry or the men of Company K, for the Germans had not abandoned their objective merely because 3 tanks had been destroyed and a bridge denied them. The 1st SS Panzer Division, one of the most formidable units in the German army and the spearhead of the northern thrust in the Ardennes, was pressing hard against the 30th Division's positions, and the fighting around Malmedy continued with relentless ferocity. Curry, despite his exhaustion, took his place in the defensive line, his hands too stiff from cold and exertion to properly grip his rifle. His uniform still wet from snow that had melted against his body heat and then frozen again, creating a shell of ice that cracked and crunched with every movement. The men he had rescued were evacuated to the rear, their chances of survival now real where they had been non-existent hours before, but others took their place in the casualty lists as German artillery pounded American positions and probing attacks tested the line's strength. Curry's actions had bought time, but time was a currency that bought only more fighting, more dying, more the endless consumption of young men that characterized the Battle of the Bulge. Through the long night, he moved from position to position, encouraging his squad, directing fire, demonstrating the same leadership under fire that had characterized his daylight heroics. The bridge remained intact, its demolition charges still in place should the line break, but Curry had made that contingency less likely with his stand. German commanders, receiving reports of heavy losses and determined resistance, began to divert their forces to other crossing points, looking for weaker positions to exploit, and this redirection of effort was precisely what the overall American strategy required. Every hour that the 30th Division held, every bridge that remained denied to the Germans, brought the Allied counterattack closer to readiness. Patton's Third Army was already wheeling north to strike the German southern flank, and powerful forces were being assembled to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne and push back the bulge that had been created in the Allied line. But these strategic movements were invisible to the soldiers in the foxholes, who knew only their own sector, their own desperate struggle to hold against an enemy that seemed to have infinite reserves of men and material. The morning of December 22nd brought no relief, only a new German attack that tested the positions around the bridge once more. This time there were no tanks, or perhaps the tank commanders had heard what awaited armor in this sector. But the infantry assault was pressed with determination, German soldiers advancing through the snow, supported by machine guns and mortars, trying to overwhelm the American line by sheer weight of numbers. Curry was everywhere in the defense, appearing at points of crisis, his presence steadying nervous soldiers, his accurate fire breaking up German formations before they could close with American positions. He had become more than a soldier. He had become a symbol to the men around him, proof that one determined individual could make a difference, that the German offensive could be stopped by courage and skill as much as by tanks and artillery. By afternoon, the German attack had been repulsed with heavy losses, and the line held. This pattern would continue for days, the Germans attacking, the Americans defending, the bridge at Malmedy remaining firmly in Allied hands. When the 30th Division was finally relieved and sent to rest and refit, they left behind a battlefield marked by burnt-out vehicles and frozen casualties, but the vital crossing remained intact, its importance proven by the German efforts to take it and the American determination to hold it. Curry, for his part, returned to the routine of a soldier in a combat zone, expecting nothing special for his actions, believing that he had simply done what needed to be done, what any soldier would do for his comrades. He didn't know that officers had submitted recommendations for decoration, that his name was being mentioned in division and corps headquarters with something like or that the story of the 19-year-old who had destroyed 3 tanks and saved 5 men was spreading through the army. He didn't know that in the highest councils of the military, his actions were being weighed against the standard of the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, reserved for those who distinguish themselves conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The process of award and recognition moved slowly, buried in bureaucracy, requiring verification and witness statements and the endorsement of multiple levels of command, but the facts were not in dispute. Multiple soldiers had seen Curry destroy the tanks, had watched him crawl out to rescue the wounded, had fought beside him the subsequent defense of the position. The recommendation moved upward, and Curry continued to fight, serving through the remainder of the war in Europe, surviving when so many did not, carrying with him the memories of that December day that would shape the rest of his long life. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. And Francis Curry returned to the United States with the same quiet demeanor he had carried into combat, seemingly unchanged by the extraordinary events that had marked his service. He was still just 20 years old, though he had aged decades in experience, and he faced the same challenge that confronted millions of returning veterans: building a life in peace after mastering the art of war. The Medal of Honor was approved in short order, the paperwork accelerated by the unmistakable nature of his heroism, and on July 27, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented the medal to Curry in a White House ceremony. The citation read with the formal precision of military prose, describing the destruction of the 3 tanks and the rescue of the 5 wounded men. But the words on paper could not capture the fear and cold and desperate determination of that December day, could not convey what it meant to be 19 years old and responsible for the lives of so many. Curry accepted the medal with the same modesty that had characterized his actions, believing truly that he had done nothing more than his duty, that the men who had died beside him were the real heroes, that surviving was its own form of luck rather than skill. This perspective, common among Medal of Honor recipients, reflected a fundamental truth about combat heroism. Those who performed such acts rarely considered themselves heroic, viewing their actions instead as necessary responses to impossible circumstances, as the only available choice in situations where all choices led to death or dishonor. After the war, Curry built a life away from the spotlight that the medal brought, working in the Veterans Administration and later running his own business, raising a family, and contributing to his community in Hurleville, New York. He spoke rarely of his experiences, not out of trauma, though surely that existed, but from a belief that some things were too important to be cheapened by casual retelling, that the memory of those who had fallen deserved respect rather than publicity. When he did speak, it was usually to young people, to veterans groups, to those who needed to hear that courage was possible, that one person could make a difference, that the values of service and sacrifice remained relevant in a changing world. The bridge at Malmedy that he had defended became a historical footnote in the larger story of the Battle of the Bulge, overshadowed by the siege of Bastogne and the heroic stand of the 101st Airborne. But military historians understood its significance. Had the Germans captured that bridge, had their tanks crossed the Amblève and driven for the Maze, the entire northern shoulder of the Allied line might have collapsed, extending the war and costing thousands of additional lives. Curry's stand, made in isolation and without orders, had strategic consequences far beyond its tactical scale, demonstrating once again how individual initiative and raw courage could shape the course of history. In his later years, as the generation of World War II veterans thinned and their stories became the province of historians rather than participants, Curry remained a living connection to that pivotal moment in human history. He attended reunions of the 30th Division, visited the battlefields of his youth, and watched as the world he had helped save changed in ways he could never have imagined in 1944. The Medal of Honor, that light blue ribbon with its white stars, rested in a case somewhere in his home, a physical testament to a day when a boy from upstate New York had stood against the machinery of Nazi Germany and prevailed. Francis Sherman Curry died on October 8, 2019, at the age of 94, the last surviving World War II Medal of Honor recipient from the state of New York. His passing marked the end of an era, the gradual disappearance of the generation that had faced down totalitarianism and built the world that followed. But his story remains, preserved in military archives and historical accounts, waiting to inspire those who come after, a testament to what is possible when ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and choose, against all reason and expectation, to stand and fight. The bridge at Malmedy still stands, rebuilt and modernized, carrying traffic across the Amblève as if December 21st, 1944, were just another day. But those who know the history can stand upon it and feel the weight of what happened there, can imagine the cold and the fear and the courage of a 19-year-old soldier who refused to yield, who saved lives and changed history through the simple, profound act of doing his duty. Francis Curry would have said he was just a soldier, just doing his job, but history remembers him as something more, a hero in the truest sense. Not because he sought glory, but because he demonstrated, in the darkest hour of the war, the light that human courage could bring to the world.